I give it about 1 more minute before we get started. All right, well, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to this National Association of Scholars webinar. My name is John Seiler. I'm a fellow at the National Association of Scholars, and I will be moderating today's event, which is the first in a series titled Right Ideas, where we examine thinkers who have influenced today's political right. Today, we're beginning the series with a discussion of James Burnham, a figure who until recently appeared to be all but forgotten. James Burnham was a philosopher and political theorist, chair of the philosophy department at NYU, and early on a committed Trotskyist. Despite his beginnings on the political left, however, Burnham eventually became an influential voice in the American conservative movement, serving as an editor of National Review. His background gave him a unique perspective on the role of class in modern politics, which, among other things, influenced one of his more famous books, The Managerial Revolution. He was a prolific writer, and many of his books are relevant to the political conversations that we have today. In just a moment, you will hear from our panelists, but first I wanted to give you an idea of what to expect from this event. After I introduce our speakers, they will each have 12 to 14 minutes to speak. At the conclusion of their remarks, I will read questions from you, the audience, to our panelists. So please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the event. If your questions don't get answered, feel free to send them to us at contact@nas.org, and we will forward them along to the panelists so that they can answer them via email. The event will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to the email address you used to register, and it will also be available at our National Association of Scholars YouTube page. Thank you very much for joining us for this event, and without further ado, allow me to briefly introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker will be Julius Krein, the editor of American Affairs, a quarterly journal of policy and political economy. Julius is also, in part, I would say, responsible for the recent renewed interest in James Burnham. Daniel Mccarthy is vice president of the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and editor of ISI's journal Modern Age. And Aaron Wren is a senior fellow at American Reformer. He was previously senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a partner at the consulting firm Accenture. So thank you so much, panelists, for being here. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and ask Julius to come and begin the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be able to participate in this. Not to contradict your introductory remarks, but I have to be honest, it's been a couple of years since I've really had cause to think about and reflect on Burnham and the larger kind of theoretical questions he introduced. I've spent the last few years really focused mainly on technocratic, one might even say managerial aspects of economic policy. So it's nice to revisit some of these larger questions. And I say that mainly out of gratitude, but partially as a warning. I have never professed to be a scholar of Burnham in the academic sense. If anyone has any questions about obscure letters he wrote in 1971 or something, I encourage you to direct those to the other panelists. But I want to focus my remarks today on what I consider the main reasons behind the resurgence of interest in Burnham in recent years. And I'm speaking mainly of the Managerial Revolution and also the Machiavellians, books published in 1941 and 1943, I believe. And I'll also talk briefly about Congress and the American Tradition, which I think was published in 1959. I believe actually, to the extent my subjective reading of obscure corners of the internet is correct, that their interest in those books is very much appropriate. I consider those Burnham's really most insightful works and also the best at kind of explaining and analyzing the underlying socioeconomic and political features that are driving our world and explain a lot of the trends we see today. In particular, I would highlight, well, actually, before I do that, let me just, because I'm the first panelist, maybe discuss a little bit about what managerialism means very briefly, for those who may not have read it. What Burnham is referring to here is really a kind of shift in the economic order from the kind of what we might call classical capitalist world, maybe that of Adam Smith, of kind of smallholder, bourgeois, family-owned, family-operated businesses, to the modern large corporation, which occurred, maybe just before and during his lifetime and his writing years. In particular, Burnham noted the separation of ownership and control, which was highlighted by Adolf Berle and Gardner Means, who became figures in the New Deal. And that also had political valences as well. That shift in the economic structure, Burnham saw, was also related to a shift in politics away from, say, Congress and representative bodies toward administrative bureaucracies. And I would argue that the Machiavellians, maybe even it takes a slightly different approach to a similar topic and sort of describes elite conflict as kind of the driver of politics and also both the source of political oppression and political freedom, which I'll get into later. With that being said, I'm going to highlight, I think, five sorts of trends or phenomena that I think are behind the resurgence of interest in Burnham today. And I will, again, another caveat, I'm going to prioritize dramatic effect and alliteration in naming these categories as opposed to precision. I've been around the pundit world long enough to know what sells. The first one I'm calling the end of the Cold War. Second, the end of neoliberalism. Third, the end of conservatism. Fourth, the end of Congress. And fifth, the end of democracy. The end of the Cold War, perhaps the least controversial of them all. And I think this is significant for us today. One, because, again, Burnham's analysis and description of managerialism really begins with the kind of notion that managerialism underlies or transcends or pervades kind of conventional ideological political categories. And he gets a lot of criticism, for allegedly predicting, for example, that Germany would win World War II. I don't actually read him that way. I think what he actually says is sort of managerialism will win the war. And he also kind of implies that both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were more advanced forms at that time of managerialism than the New Deal United States. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is this kind of analysis that minimizes perhaps the superficial and ideological differences between regime types is obviously a very uncomfortable thing to do in the midst of the Cold War. And Burnham himself becomes a very ardent Cold Warrior, very anti-Soviet thinker and advocate. And needless to say, I think that kind of element of managerial analysis progressively disappears from his thought over time. It's kind of interesting, Irving Kristol was writing some essays, maybe in the 70s, early 80s, kind of saying that fighting the oddity that both the West was constantly looking to expand their welfare state and the Soviets were always looking to kind of introduce capitalist competition into their systems. But nevertheless, I think that the kind of analysis that suggests that both the Soviet Union and the United States political systems may have more in common or be different branches of the same root, very difficult thing to do in the Cold War. That may, with that over, I think we can come back and look at that, though that may be changing again now with China. we'll see. But on that note, the other point I would add on this first point is, the notion of the end of history, particularly the end of Cold War, end of history. Burnham in some ways was ahead of that. And I think our interpretation of the end of history at the end of the Cold War would have been much more sober, much more cautious, much less triumphalist about quote unquote liberal democracy, had we perhaps not forgotten Burnham and managerialism in the intervening years. My second contention is the end of neoliberalism. And of course, I'm exaggerating here. Neoliberalism is not quite over, even if nobody really likes it anymore. But what I want to argue here is that neoliberalism always presented itself as a kind of anti-managerialism. And there's a new book out by Gary Gersel called, I think, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. And it's very good at going through the systematically both right and left kind of variants of neoliberalism, and both kind of its economic and cultural aspects. But both right and left neoliberals saw themselves as opponents of kind of the mid-century bureaucracy, mid-century political consensus, also the mid-century kind of corporate concentration and very bureaucratized sort of IBM, GM, that model of governance, where kind of the managers, in a very narrow sense, were extremely dominant and in control. And I think what we've seen over the last decade or two is kind of the end of a lot of these neoliberal dreams. In the first place, the right neoliberalism, you might say, thought that by giving more power to finance, to shareholders, that they were pushing back against the managers. And I think they failed to see that finance itself, they're called financial managers for a reason. And they're managing capital on behalf of other institutions, often other managers, and the kind of chain of managers, in many cases, never quite ends. And at the same time, the left, the sort of new left, they thought they were pushing back against a lot of managerial mass organizations, entrenched party structures, unions in many cases, entrenched corporate and political bureaucracies, and the kind of shift to a more freewheeling NGO issue-driven system, I think was what could be described as left anti-managerialism, or at least that's what it began as. But of course, NGOs have very much become part of their own managerial organizations and hold a very managerial order. And so we see across, the economy in particular, what the mid-century anti-managers or neoliberals, very upset with what they would call the nifty 50 big corporations dominating the economy. And yet what we have today, if anything, is sort of like the Fang Five. There's been incredible concentration. And the notion that cutting taxes and deregulation would sort of get government out of business, I don't think that's really come to pass. Government and business are deeply intertwined, as we see with the tech companies. The Fed is more important than ever. Corporate bailouts are a kind of cyclical norm, and so on and so forth. And in the cultural realm, it's hard for me to state too strong an opinion on this since I wasn't around in 1965. But certainly the idea that we have a more freewheeling, less conformist culture today is, I think, at the very least, highly disputable. There's another famous, I will refer to him as a somewhat controversial blogger, who's also a very astute reader of Burnham, who has posited the notion of the cathedral. And I think, that kind of, the concentration that we've seen in the corporate world, kind of in contrast to neoliberal dreams, we've also seen in many respects in the cultural realm. Third factor I mentioned, the end of conservatism. And what I mean here is of course, the fusionist movement conservatism of Buckley's National Review was classically understood, which of course Burnham was a part of. And the fusion, the notion of fusionism essentially is that the market and what we might call traditional values go together and uphold each other. And I think it's fair to say that in an age of woke capital, of ubiquitous pornography, rampant drug use, et cetera, very few, if anyone, really believes that market and traditional values are natural or consistent allies today. But I don't want to just leave it there at that point. I think it's important to recall that this notion didn't come out of nowhere, and certainly in the classical capitalism, the pre-managerial capitalism, I think one could argue there was a lot to it. That sort of bourgeois ethic, the quote unquote Protestant ethic, perhaps the Victorian moral system, those were all real things. And I think it's also, what's important to point out is that this notion of the tension between traditional morality and the market, it is not at all a new thing for conservatism. If anything, what I find kind of most interesting about a lot of this is actually the leading lights of what I would call, or what is called neoconservatism, but I'm referring to the original neoconservatism, the intelligent ones, not the people called neocons today. Daniel Bell and Irving Kristol, those sorts of people. Daniel Bell, of course, writes, his most famous work, The Contradictions of Capitalism, about precisely the divergence between, in the 1960s, the sort of adversary culture on the one hand and conventional capitalist economic practice on the other, contrasting that with the revolutionary capitalism of previous eras and the fairly traditional bourgeois morality. And Irving Kristol makes similar points, positing a new class and its morality. What's strange to me is that Burnham's notion of the kind of economic order matching or underlying or driving, being associated with the moral order, kind of disappears from these polemics or these analyses. And Irving Kristol and Bell in particular are sort of at pains to describe how these kind of contradictory forms of morality can consist with conventional capitalism, and how in Irving Kristol's case particular, how this sort of deviant new class arises and becomes hostile to capitalism. But I think Burnham offers a much clearer sort of analysis in describing, conventional capitalism had become something very different. It had become managerial capitalism, and the morality of the new class fit particularly with the economic order of managerialism, particularly a focus on consumption, debt finance, managing financial returns over the kind of merchant adventurer model, globalization, quote unquote, versus kind of national development economic orientations. And I wonder if perhaps, Burnham's progression into movement conservatism maybe inhibited some of what could have been a more clear-eyed analysis about these trends at the time. And I think, today it's interesting when we see a lot of institutions that were formerly identified very strongly with conservatism, the military, national security apparatus, law enforcement apparatuses like the FBI, now becoming hostile to, or at least perceived as hostile to, and often targets of conservative ire. I think Burnham can help, and Burnham's concept of managerialism can help us understand a lot of what's going on and why that sort of fusionist movement toward free markets didn't produce the kind of traditional values that mid-century fusionist conservatives perhaps thought it would. The next factor I highlighted, I'm perhaps a little low on time, I'll move along here, is the end of Congress. And of course, I don't mean that Congress has ended, and I have many good friends in Congress, and I'm always impressed by the staff and actually how extraordinary some of them are despite very low pay. But I think it's fair to say, and it's been said for a long time now, that the importance of Congress has diminished considerably over the decades. And also, I think few people today would really accept kind of the, I don't know, schoolhouse rock version of politics, where, you know, if you don't like something, you call your congressman, and that's really going to make a difference. Burnham wrote a really excellent book. It's less theoretically ambitious or grandiose, perhaps, but a book on the role of Congress in the American tradition. The point of which was really that without Congress, if Congress doesn't work, America will cease to be America. And it draws on, I think, a lot of the insight of the Managerial Revolution in pointing out the shift from the kind of classical capitalism and its this centrality of parliamentary representation in that socioeconomic model, with managerial capitalism and what we call the administrative state and bureaucratic, kind of technocratic governance of more recent decades. And I think that the diagnosis that he outlines really can't be critiqued. It does feel to me, however, that in that book, he really didn't have much to offer in the way of solutions. There was not much of an attempt to sort of reconcile the need to make Congress work in America with the kind of realities of managerial economic systems that he had identified in previous work, and the inevitability, perhaps, of managerialism. And I think it was a real loss there, that there wasn't perhaps a better attempt to sort of reconcile them and make the best of them, rather than leaving a pretty negative kind of approach that has led to what I would consider a lot of futile and, in many cases, perhaps counterproductive efforts among conservatives to dismantle the administrative state that have not really gone anywhere. But certainly, if one wants to understand the rise of the administrative state and its durability, I think Burnham's diagnosis of this in the Congress and the American tradition, and earlier in the Managerial Revolution, are very helpful. And finally, what I call the end of democracy. Of course, I don't mean that democracy is over per se, nor am I referring to January 6th or allegations of stolen elections or things like that. I'm talking about a much more prosaic reality, I think, that we see every day and don't really pay much attention to, which is just think about the way that elections are often discussed and analyzed, you know, on cable news or whatever. It's, you know, who's raising money from whom, what are the focus groups, what are the polls. So much of this is in the hands of, you know, we call them campaign consultants. They're really kind of democracy managers in a certain way. And, you know, I've been kind of doing political stuff which takes up most of my time now for the last 5-6 years. I've been in a lot of meetings on both left and right with large donors, large NGOs, politicians, etc. I can't think of a single occasion in those events where the main discussion was, this is what people really want, and we've got to figure out how to get it done. It's always, this is what we want. And at the most positive, it's here's how we convince the people that that's what they want too. And sometimes it's basically, here's how we're going to deceive them into thinking that this is what they want. And we've got all kinds of focus groups and marketing techniques and all this other stuff to essentially, I think, manage democracy, which is a loaded term. And I'm not referring to, the academic analysis that calls it Russia or whatever, but just the prosaic reality of, I think, a lot of democratic politics is done today. And the shift from kind of, there were always smoke-filled rooms and things like that, but there's been a noticeable shift, I think, and Michael Lind has written a lot about this, from kind of large-scale mass organizations, whether it's federalized party organizations to unions, civic organizations, things like that, to a much more NGO donor-driven style of politics. And I will conclude by just saying, on this point, the common criticism of Burnham, most prominently perhaps by Orwell, is that he's kind of he's a worshiper of power, and he's criticized for that and for kind of fetishizing power. I actually dissent from that. I think it's in many ways the opposite. I think Burnham, in a way, is kind of a romantic. I don't think he ever really made his peace with managerialism, despite his analysis kind of pointing to its inevitability across all political regime types. You see that, I think, and I'm generalizing somewhat violently here, but in the Machiavellians, he talks a lot about elite competition and how, when elites are in competition, that creates spaces for freedom for the people. And there's much less discussion of what I would call responsibility. And today in particular, I think there's many cases in which the notion of freedom, particularly personal freedom, is kind of used to impose, a sort of soft despotism. Drugs, this kind of notion of adversary, kind of fake adversary culture, rebellions against already toppled hierarchies. Today, the question feels to me much less about freedom of the people than responsibility of the elites to the people. And I think, I would harken back to maybe the older Machiavellian notion of it's not so much about freedom, but competition among elites can generate that sense of responsibility. A united elite feels pretty comfortable simply exploiting the people, and perhaps doesn't even know that they're doing it because no one has any incentive to point it out. But an elite in conflict, the different factions have reasons to enlist the people on their side, or perhaps simply delegitimize the other factions by pointing out their poor service to the people, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Burnham in some ways is romantic. And I think if I were to offer a criticism or suggest some limitations of his work, it's the inability to kind of reconcile the inevitability of managerialism with kind of a revived notion of responsible government. And I think that led, not necessarily in Burnham himself, who was always very pragmatic, but in a lot of kind of subsequent Burnham epiphanies, to this notion of the Mars, the middle American radicals, to populism alone is going to allow us to take things back. Populism was behind Reagan, et cetera. When in reality, things like neoliberalism they always had very strong elite constituencies. They were arguably elite driven. And today, I think a lot of our, what we've seen with some of the flare outs of populism is that, understanding the elite and managerial elements of this are very important. So I'll conclude there. But I think certainly whatever your opinion on my own take on Burnham and these notions, all these factors have contributed to a very valuable and important resurgence of interest in his thought.
Thanks so much, Julius. And next up, we have Daniel McCarthy.
Well, I will build on much of what Julius has said, and I'll also call attention to another facet of James Burnham's thinking, which is Burnham's quite insightful views on political psychology, which in many cases he is deriving from an earlier thinker by the name of Vilfredo Pareto, as well as from Machiavelli himself. I will also talk somewhat about Burnham's views of liberalism, in particular his 1964 book, The Suicide of the West, which posits that liberalism is the ideology of Western suicide. Before I get into the details, however, let me say a few things about Burnham's general background and biography. So James Burnham is born, I believe, in Chicago in 1905. He has a strong elite education. He's clearly quite a brilliant individual, recognized even at an early point. He goes on, as the introduction had said, Burnham ultimately becomes a professor at New York University. And he falls into the kind of ideological fads that at the time, in the 1930s are quite rampant within higher education. So at this point, in the face of the Great Depression, in the face of the apparent collapse of 19th century style liberalism before communism on the one hand and fascism on the other, you have a great many intellectuals who are looking for some sort of post-capitalist and post-liberal ideology. And the most prominent of these ideologies within higher ed in the 1930s is socialism. but in particular a variety of socialism, a variety of communism, and of Marxism, in fact, that is maybe somewhat confused or ambivalent about the Soviet Union. And this is where Trotskyism comes in. So Trotskyism was a variant of communism associated with Leon Trotsky. Trotsky had lost a power struggle with Stalin in the Soviet Union. And as a result, Trotsky lived in exile for a time in Mexico, ultimately winds up getting assassinated there by an agent of Stalin. Trotskyism was a way of saying that the Soviet Union was a true workers' state, but in some ways it had been corrupted by the mere accident that Joseph Stalin had been able to seize control of it. So Trotskyism was an attempt to save some of the idealism of Bolshevism and of communism from the actual practices of the Soviet Union. Trotsky was still a great believer in a worldwide communist revolution of the sort envisioned by Karl Marx, whereas Joseph Stalin seemed to be an avatar of a merely national form of communism, that basically communism would be restricted largely within the borders of the Soviet Union. Stalin would then perhaps promote communism a little more broadly, but it was not an uprising of workers all around the world, the way that Marx had predicted and the way that Trotsky continued to believe would in fact be the future path, the inevitable path of communism. Keep in mind that Marxism had this end of history view, that the contradictions within capitalism would inevitably lead to the working class all around the world, or at least within every industrialized and developed country, to rise up, overthrow the capitalist ruling class, and establish a new kind of sort of benign dictatorship of the proletariat. The Soviet Union was seen as being a kind of mixed example of this by the Trotskyists. They thought that it had been somewhat corrupted simply by the accident of Joseph Stalin. So James Burnham, at an early stage of his intellectual development, is very interested in this idea. He doesn't quite buy into some of the more grandiose end of history notions of Trotskyism, but he does believe that capitalism is failing, liberalism is failing, and some sort of new order is going to emerge. And at first he thinks that this new order is likely to be something resembling Marxism or something resembling Trotskyism. But over time, he comes to increasingly question Trotskyist dogma about the nature of the Soviet Union and the idea that the Soviet Union truly is a workers' state, even if it's a workers' state that has been corrupted by Joseph Stalin. And so Burnham starts to ask the question, well, if the Soviet Union is not, in fact, the kind of state that Karl Marx had envisioned, the Soviet Union is not, in fact, a true workers' state, then what is it? Who's really in charge in the Soviet Union? And as Burnham looked around the world, he examined, fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And indeed, he looked at the United States, he looked at other Western countries, and he said that what he saw there was not necessarily the kind of capitalism and liberalism that had been understood as the the true form of liberalism and capitalism back in the 19th century. That in fact, Western countries like the United States had developed in a way that was quite different from what the capitalists had imagined, just even though they had not developed in the direction of communism or socialism either. Likewise, the fascists and the actual communists in power in the Soviet Union, these institutions and these parties and these states did not resemble either traditional capitalist liberal states of the 19th century, nor did they resemble the fantasy worker states of Marxism. Therefore, Burnham said there must be some other kind of transformation that is taking place here, that the world is in fact moving through stages of development. It's moving away from traditional capitalism and traditional liberalism of the 19th century, but it's not moving toward the socialism that had been envisioned, the communism that had been envisioned by Karl Marx and that Leon Trotsky continued to believe in. Instead, what was taking place was a worldwide revolution, not of the proletariat, but of a new class of managers. And Julius has given a very excellent presentation on who these managers are. The managers are, they're neither owners nor workers, but they are essential people within the center of both, corporate organizations, but also within government bureaucracies, and also within, what we would look at as being civil society and the nonprofit sector. Think of how much bureaucracy, for example, there is within our churches and within all of our organs of civil society. The kind of bureaucrat who is rising to prominence, according to Burnham, is one who combines a kind of logistical expertise and ability to actually organize things within an institution with a certain knowledge of the processes of production. So in some ways, the managers can be best understood as partly engineers, but not fully engineers, partly engineers and partly logistics experts. They're more logistics experts than they are engineers, but they are connected to the overall system of production. And there's still a little bit of residual Marxism to be found in Burnham, in his belief that changes within the material substrate of society, changes within the means of production and means of distribution, that these things are the engines that drive changes within social organization. So it's the fact that you've had mass capitalism develop, you've had these large firms develop, you've had large government bureaucracies interacting with firms develop. All of these things in combination have given rise to this new class of managers. This new class of managers has come to power in the West. It has also come to power in the fascist world, and it has come to power in the communist world. And just as within the world of sort of 19th century capitalism, you had different forms of ideology, different forms of liberalism competing with one another, forms of liberalism versus forms of conservatism that were, capitalist, but nonetheless had a certain, residual, love of the older feudal order. Just as you had this kind of variety of ideologies under capitalism in the 19th century, so too Burnham believed that in the 20th century, you would have a variety of new ideologies come to prominence. Fascism and communism were just the beginnings of what we would see as, in fact, a great efflorescence of new kinds of ideologies that are attuned to the interests and the actions of the managerial class. So I want to, pause to say that, Burnham is often criticized as thinking either that fascism would prevail in the Second World War, or as overestimating the Soviet and communist threat during the Cold War. But Burnham, in fact, all the way back to the Managerial Revolution in 1941, really did believe that these were just the first phases of what would be an ongoing worldwide revolution, and that in fact, the United States had its own parallel to this taking place under the New Deal, not only with the changes within, firms themselves within the private sector, but also with the growing number of alphabet agencies under the New Deal, and with the very close interplay between the managerial class in government bureaucracies, the alphabet agencies, and the managerial class within firms in middle management and indeed in executive management. And this is why it is a new class that has comprehensive power. It has its exponents within government bureaucracy, and it has its exponents within the corporate world. And again, this is quite different from what had been envisioned in the 19th century in terms of either liberalism or in terms of democracy, where the idea was, well, the ordinary people, ordinary voters, are going to be the ones who are in charge of governments in the West. In practice, the people who were in charge were neither the old aristocracy, the old landed class. They were not the capitalists, the old moneyed class, and they were not simply the voters either. Instead, the people who had the most power within things like the New Deal were in fact the managerial class, the experts who were going to be able to manage logistics and were going to be able to sort of claim the authority of science for their ideas and for their commands. They did not depend upon democratic legitimacy for their power, and they were not answerable to more traditional authorities either, like the church or aristocracies or what have you. So that's the nature of the managerial revolution, and it's seen as being quite a pessimistic point of view. George Orwell and a number of other critics of James Burnham see Burnham as basically a defeatist. He sees totalitarianism, whether in its fascist form in World War II or in its communist form after World War II in the Cold War. Burnham is thought to be, someone who's constantly predicting doom and gloom, who thinks that these, sort of hard forms of managerial ideology, fascism or communism, are going to prevail against the muddled and confused West, because the West is still trying to cling to a certain kind of capitalism, to some of its old traditional institutions, whereas in fact, because the wave of the future really is managerialism, these other forms of society in the fascist world and in the communist world, they're really living in the future and they are ahead of us, and therefore they're going to out-organize us, out-compete us, and they're going to prevail against us either in World War II or in the Cold War. Now, that's not really exactly what Burnham believed, although Burnham certainly did think that there were serious existential threats facing the West from other forms of managerial development, whether it's in the fascist world or in the communist world. Burnham writes his book after the Managerial Revolution, the Machiavellians, in 1943, I think in a way to give people hope, although what wound up being the case is that many people like George Orwell also saw the Machiavellians as being a very cynical book. Indeed, I mean, if you have Machiavelli in the title of your work, that may seem almost inevitable that people would brand you as a cynic. But in fact, the subtitle of the Machiavellians, at least in its second edition, was Defenders of Freedom. And if you look at the Machiavellians, published in 1943, you'll see that Burnham actually is arguing for the idea that no matter what kind of material substrate there might be, whether you're living in a sort of feudal agricultural world, whether you're living in a world of capitalism, sort of culminating in the 19th century, or whether you are living in the modern era of the managerial state and the managerial system of production and control, in all of these different forms of material base, you can nonetheless have conflicts within the elite, which, as Julius alluded to, create opportunities for freedom among the public. And I should mention, by the way, I think Julius is right to call freedom into question in certain respects, but Burnham was not just advocating, sort of freedom in a kind of antinomian or libertarian sense. In fact, what Burnham believed in was, this sort of clash of powers that would allow some degree of freedom in the best sense, a freedom for human beings to live, without suffering, total oppression, and to have, some degree of fluidity within society, some degree of innovation. And this, in fact, Burnham thought would ultimately be beneficial for even the ruling class of society. That, in fact, Burnham was a big believer in Vilfredo Pareto's idea of a circulation of elites, that when you have an elite that has clung to power for too long, it tends to become calcified, it tends to become bad not only at serving the public, to whatever extent it may ever have served the public, but even it becomes bad at maintaining itself in power, and the entire society becomes vulnerable to attack from the outside or to collapse from within. And so Pareto and Burnham both believed that there was a need for a certain amount of openness within the elite and a circulation that would bring in new blood and new ideas into the elite, and not simply, sort of closing the doors, closing the ranks, and creating a, sort of calcified aristocracy of any kind, whether it was a landed aristocracy, a capitalist moneyed aristocracy, or a managerial technocratic aristocracy. So that is the nature of the Machiavellians. And Burnham goes on in the course of World War II to become a consultant to the OSS. He later becomes a consultant and indeed someone rather deeply involved with the CIA in the post-World War II Cold War environment. In fact, Burnham is in many ways one of the great strategists, along with George Kennan, of U.S. policy during the Cold War. And ultimately, Burnham's ideas tend to lose out to George Kennan's ideas, but they are, sort of competing poles of Cold War strategy. And Burnham, he has a book called Containment or Liberation, where it's clear that Burnham wishes to be a voice for liberation. But what he means by liberation, and he's talking about sort of liberation and active measures against the communist bloc in the Cold War. What Burnham is talking about is what would be called political warfare, basically, supporting subversion within the communist bloc in order to bring down communist governments and in order to frustrate the aims of communists in trying to spread their ideology and to spread their power and their form of government to other states around the world. So Burnham becomes involved in things like, for example, the coup in Iran, which winds up, getting rid of a prime minister who was drifting in a socialist direction and firming up the, absolute power of the Shah within Iran, which ultimately, of course, brings about a certain amount of blowback. Burnham is also, at least an advisor to American policy in Latin America during the Cold War. And, in many ways, Burnham is seen as being a kind of mastermind of a hardline Cold War policy. But in fact, Burnham's ideas over time develop. And Burnham, thinks that the United States really could have done nothing in the midst of the Hungarian uprising against Soviet control, for example. Burnham is a realist fundamentally. And he thinks that, in fact, there are limits on US power, and there are limits on Soviet power as well. And he comes to, eventually believe that Khrushchev really did represent a certain kind of thawing after Stalin. And he did come to think that the Soviet Union was perhaps not quite as powerful as he initially thought it was in the aftermath of World War II. Well, as Burnham's ideas develop more and more in this Cold War direction in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and as Burnham, through the CIA, comes to be acquainted with a young man by the name of William F. Buckley Jr., as well as a number of other thinkers such as Willy Schlamm and Wilmore Kendall and more, Burnham becomes involved in Buckley's project of starting a new conservative magazine for the Cold War era, which becomes National Review. That's founded in 1955 Burnham becomes a senior editor of National Review, and William F. Buckley Jr. refers to James Burnham as his paramount collaborator on National Review. In fact, after the death of William F. Buckley Jr.'s father, William F. Buckley Sr., Buckley even writes a very tender letter to James Burnham where he says, "You are the closest thing I have now to a father." So Burnham was a tremendous influence on Buckley, but Burnham was in many ways out of place within the environment of National Review. Burnham was not a believer in the philosophy of fusionism that Frank Meyer had promoted. Burnham was not even a believer in the sort of right wing of the Republican Party. So Burnham was more favorably inclined towards Rockefeller Republicans than he was toward right-wing Republicans like Barry Goldwater. In fact, Burnham was scathingly critical of Barry Goldwater. And so Burnham becomes this kind of interesting figure. He's seen as being a kind of Cold War mastermind in the pages of National Review, where he initially writes a column called The Third World War. But at the same time, he's also seen as not quite being a team player when it comes to conservative ideology. He's not a believer necessarily in small government. He's not a believer in sort of Goldwaterism. And even when it comes to the Cold War, Burnham is a realist rather than an ideologue, rather than a believer in, sort of Western idealism triumphing against, communist despotism. Instead, Burnham believes that power is the currency of politics, and that includes in foreign policy. Now, in 1964, Burnham writes a very important book. In fact, it's the last sort of full-length original book that he writes, called The Suicide of the West. And its thesis is that liberalism is the ideology of Western suicide. And I should very briefly spell out what that means. He's not saying that liberalism is causing the West to have suicidal tendencies. What he's instead saying is that liberalism is the ideological rationalization of a suicidal tendency within the West. Now, what does it mean to have a suicidal tendency within the West? Well, in the context of the Cold War, Burnham certainly saw this as being the tendency of liberals and indeed Westerners in general not to take the communist threat seriously and to be willing to accommodate communism, to have, sort of appeasement of communist power. So part of it was this idea that the West was not being hardline enough in the Cold War. But there was much more to the idea of Western suicide and liberalism's role in justifying it in the pages of Burnham's Suicide of the West, because he also saw anti-colonialism, the fact that Western power was retreating in the third world and developing world, and that in fact, as Western power retreated, the developing world usually, sort of professed actively anti-Western ideologies in response to the retreat of Western imperialism and colonialism. Burnham saw this too as being a sign of Western suicide. Why? Because the West was not actually losing wars or losing economic competition, either with the third world or with the Soviet bloc. Instead, every time the West sort of retreated from an area of the world, the West was retreating simply on its own initiative. It was retreating because it had this suicidal impulse to contract within itself rather than expanding or rather than even holding its influence within the world steady. And you could also see this suicidal tendency in the West within the West itself, that among Western liberal leaders, for example, there was, a pathological hatred of conservatives and indeed a tendency to view conservatives as themselves being pathological. So liberalism, even back in the 1960s, when Burnham publishes The Suicide of the West, was already talking about conservatism as being a manifestation of an authoritarian personality and of generally being a kind of mental illness. As indeed today you see liberals claiming that conservatives are fascist, that they are the product of sort of patriarchal, cis-hetero, patriarchal homes that have, created a bad sort of human being, and that there is a need for liberalism to liberate us from all of the institutions that have created this kind of, sort of pathological, sort of toxically masculine psychology, that all of this is a product of our institutions, which liberalism is now trying to destroy. And Burnham, as a man of the right, looked at the fact that liberalism was trying to destroy church and family and, and conservatism as a philosophy. And he said, actually, what's going on here is that liberalism is destroying the very things that had created Western success in the first place. And this is basically suicidal, even if liberalism understands this project as being one of liberation rather than as one of self-murder. And you can see a variety of other applications of this as well. Liberalism, for example, already in the 1960s had a very tender view of criminals, including violent criminals. We see this right now, of course, in the anarchy that's overtaken our cities, the violence that's taking place in our cities. This was already getting started when Burnham was writing, and Burnham, I think, would feel very much confirmed in his views if he were to see the world that we live in 2022. And in fact, I think Burnham, in all of the predictions that he's making in, and all the analysis that he's offering in The Suicide of the West, turns out to be correct pretty much on every front, except perhaps the front of communism. And, when people are asked, well, how did Burnham get communism wrong when that was kind of the central, concern of so many of his books and so much of his work in the 1950s? I think there may be three things we can say about that. The first is, even if you go back to the Managerial Revolution in 1941, James Burnham saw the USSR as being a primitive, early version of managerialism. He didn't think the USSR was in its own final form. He thought that the Soviet Union would continue to change. And he certainly thought that other forms of managerialism, including fascism, were actually more advanced, more sophisticated, and more powerful than communism was. So Burnham was not quite as, much a believer in communism as the wave of the future as, people might have thought based on some of his 1950s works. We also see that in some ways, communism has in fact proved to be as durable as a form of managerialism as Burnham predicted, not in the form of the Soviet Union, but instead in the form of communist China. And in fact, if you look at the system of government that communist China actually has, where it combines, bureaucratic control of the free market with certain free market elements that are themselves highly, infiltrated by bureaucracy, we'll see that communist China today looks, in fact, not like, traditional communism as envisioned by Marx or Lenin or Trotsky. In fact, what communist China looks like is exactly like the picture of managerialism that James Burnham presented in the Managerial Revolution in 1941. So in fact, if Burnham was wrong about the Soviet Union, he was right and, sort of doubly right about China. But there's, I think, a little bit more that we can say about, what's happening right now in the West, which is, perhaps our paramount concern. So whatever Burnham may have said about communism as the wave of the future, the question right now is, why are we still in this death grip? Why is the West suicidal? Why does the West, sort of embrace liberalism as this justification for the suicidal impulse that it already has? And again, Burnham doesn't see liberalism as being the cause of Western suicide. Rather, it is the rationalization, justification for the suicidal impulse that already exists. And the few minutes remaining to me, I'll just say that I think the answer to this largely lies in one of Burnham's earlier books, his 1943 book, The Machiavellians, where he talks a great deal about political psychology, drawing both upon Machiavelli and also upon a late 19th and early 20th century sociologist and economist by the name of Vilfredo Pareto. And Pareto says that there are two dominant, what he calls residues in the political psychology of almost any society, and certainly the societies of the West. The first one of these residues, which Pareto calls the class one residue, he calls it a residue because it's what's left when you get rid of all of the irrelevant elements of political psychology. Class one residue is the instinct for combination. And Pareto relates this instinct for combinations to the character type that Machiavelli describes as foxes. So these are people who have they have a love of novelty. They are maybe intellectuals who like to combine ideas in new ways. They're also entrepreneurs and innovators who combine material processes in new ways. And they may even be sort of bohemian individuals who conduct their own lifestyles in innovative ways and, doing things with new combinations of, sort of sexes or new combinations of, sort of dietary regimes. It could be any number of things. But clearly these class one residues, the instinct for combinations, is something that's generally a kind of anti-traditional psychological disposition among a certain number of people in any society. Now, in contrast to the class one residues, there are what Pareto identified as the class two residues. And these involve the persistence of aggregates. What that means is basically loyalty to the group. And there is some correspondence between this loyalty to groups and what Machiavelli had described as the lion-like preference for the use of force in society, as opposed to the use of fraud that is, identified with the foxes. So Machiavelli refers to a certain category as lions. There's some difference between what Machiavelli is talking about and what Pareto is talking about, but for simplicity's sake, I will simply refer to these people as lions. And these lions, they believe in the persistence of aggregates, which means they want to keep together the way of life that they are familiar with, the combination of ideas that they are familiar with, the combination of human beings in a national form or family form that they are familiar with. These are people who have conservative instincts. What has happened, however, I think, is this, and I will, sort of segue on to Aaron in just a minute, because I know Aaron's going to talk more about sort of practical responses to what Burnham has been discussing. I'm going to sort of lay this on the line as what I think is driving Western suicide. It is the idea that the Foxes were so successful at unleashing innovation over the course of the past 3 centuries or so. Basically, you see this tremendous scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution, all of the new prosperity we get, not only with traditional capitalism in the 19th century, but with some of the forms of investment in new military technologies, radar, GPS, the internet, all of these things that we see in the 20th century that are also developed by capitalists. You see at the same time this great efflorescence of culture, the proliferation of novels, proliferation of new forms of music, film, etc. All of this is the product of people who have these class 1 residues and these fox-like dispositions. They create a very prosperous, very successful world. They often do it by breaking down the more traditional kinds of aggregates that the lions, the class 2 residue folks had been loyal to. What happens, however, is that once these creative people, the foxes, have done their work and have created this new kind of prosperity and this new kind perhaps of freedom that people are enjoying, is that there's a certain calcification that sets in, and that the next generation of lions, the next generation of people who believe in the persistence of aggregates, instead of being connected to traditional aggregates like the family and the nation state and the church, the next generation of lions actually grabs onto and calcifies the innovations of the previous generation of foxes. So what you wind up with are people who are basically very dull. They're basically conservative in the worst sense, that they're not very creative. They simply do what is, sort of rote and expected of them. But what is rote and expected of them now is not, sort of the traditional sources of, healthy lives, but instead is the ideology that was created by foxes in a previous generation. And this is why we see so much dullness and conformity among the liberals of our time, among the progressives of our time, but also among the conservatives of our time. And it's why the conservatives of our time are often just the liberals of 15 minutes ago or the radicals of half an hour ago. The conservatives of our time basically have these class 2 residue dispositions. They believe in the persistence of aggregates, but at this point, they are mostly attaching themselves to the aggregates that were created by 19th century liberals and, in fact, by many 20th century radicals. And that's why you find, these conservatives who have confusingly identified themselves with so-called classical liberalism. So you have this great, conformity within our society, but it's conformity to what had originally been a very radical disposition. And so as a result, we no longer have the creative powers of the radicals of the 19th and 20th century, but we also don't have the traditional forms of support for a basic society in terms of religion, the family, the state, etc. So instead, what we have is the worst of both worlds, the worst of the foxes in terms of the destruction of what is traditional, but also the worst of the lions in terms of blind adherence to an ideology of liberalism that is now long out of date. So with that, I will wrap up and turn it over to Aaron.
Thanks so much. Aaron, go ahead.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is illustrate the continuing relevance of Burnham's managerial revolution thesis by applying it to a concrete situation today in a way that I hope might help you explain some things you might have observed, maybe in the town where you live, which is the changes in the composition and nature of local civic elites, particularly in cities. The name Managerial Revolution, I think, gives us the impression that it is a discrete event like the American Revolution or the French Revolution. I prefer to think of the Managerial Revolution as a process, as managerialism essentially devours more and more and more of society over time. And in the past, there have been many forces that worked to restrict or retard the advance of managerialism, or in some way counterbalance it in our society. One was social class and the existence of other social classes. One example would be the old WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites, the old upper class that dominated America up through the 1960s. They, as a wealthy, high-status social group, through their solidarity as a class, were able to serve as a countervailing force against the managers for a period of time. This is part of that divided elite that Burnham talked about in the Machiavellians. Well, that group of people essentially went out of business in the 60s. for the most part. The Cold War also imposed an external discipline on managerialism. It actually had to function, it had to do things, it had to be competent because there was this existential threat from a peer strategic rival, the Soviet Union. With the end of the Cold War, that check has been largely gone. We may add that may believe China replaces it, but we have not yet adjusted to China as a geostrategic peer competitor in the way that we did the Soviet Union. A third countervailing force was local elites or regional sectional elites who were rooted in local economic interests. And so that's a little bit of what I want to talk about, particularly the impact of deregulation in the 70s and the 80s, and also a little bit technology in essentially nationalizing much more of the economy than had previously been nationalized. So if you go back to the 1980s, there were big national businesses like manufacturers such as, say, General Motors. But many industries in the United States were very fragmented and organized on a local or regional basis. Some of this was due to economic reasons, that there was an economic driver of consolidation. Much of it was due to regulatory reasons. One of the key industries in which that was the case was banking, commercial banking. In 1980, virtually no states permitted interstate bank mergers or bank branching. Even within states, bank branching was typically heavily restricted. Many states would not let a bank expand outside of its home county. Other states were what were called unit banking states. They would not even allow banks to open branches at all. They could have the head office and that was it. By the end of the 1980s, interstate bank mergers were essentially universal. There was massive deregulation of banking. But in the 1980s, every major city basically had its own cadre of locally owned banks. Here in Indianapolis, that was the three big banks were American Fletcher, Indiana National Bank, and Merchants National Bank. And the fortunes of these businesses were deeply tied to the fortunes of the local community because they couldn't do business outside of Marion County, where they were based. The only way for them to grow as businesses was for the county to grow, for there to be more volume of loan demand, more prosperity from more deposits, more customers, et cetera. So you had a local elite tied deeply to the fortunes of the community, which was an external check, again, on their behavior, similar to the Cold War. And these businesses were, in a sense, managerial in that they were big enough to have to be administered. But unlike a big corporation like General Motors, the president of a local bank had much more of a personalized control over the details of that operation in a way that would have been the case for, than say, the president of General Motors. Another industry that was hyper-fragmented, important industry, was utilities. The Public Utility Holding Company Act basically prohibited utility mergers, and therefore every city had its own utilities. And again, the president of the electric company had to basically grow demand for electricity in his city in order to grow his profits, grow his business. Another industry that was fairly fragmented at the time was retail, certain aspects of retail, such as department stores. Many cities still had their own legacy department stores. The pharmacy business still had mostly local and regional chains, et cetera. So there were these important businesses, powerful businesses that were fragmented, locally based, and the CEOs of these businesses were very powerful local power brokers, and their personal and business fortunes were deeply tied to the overall prosperity of their community. The president of the biggest local bank was probably the single most powerful individual in town from a business community perspective. It's also notable that these were all what I call operating businesses. There used to be an old quip about banking that it was about 3-6-3. You take in deposits at 3%, you make loans at 6%, you hit the golf course at 3. The president of the bank can play golf at 3 because he's got a cash register back at the office that never stops ringing. This is true also of electricity, of these other businesses. This is in contrast to what I call transactional businesses, like consulting, my old business, law, people who bill by the hour, make money by the deal, make money by the project, construction companies, things of that nature. Very different. There were a lot of powerful operating businesses. So in the 90s, we went into a period of mass consolidation of these industries, partially due to deregulation, also partially due to technology. business became more technological. You got economies of scale from technological deployment. And also you needed to have a certain scale to effectively invest in large technology. When I worked for Accenture, and it was then Anderson Consulting in the 1990s, we feasted on this stuff. And so I think the 90s were the era of nationalization. We associate the 90s with globalization because key things like NAFTA, the Uruguay round of trade talks, the China's admission into the WTO happened basically in the 90s, but that didn't really have effect really that much until the 2000s, after the 2000s. The 90s really saw tremendous nationalization of a lot of business and a reorientation to a more national business culture. Just as an example, Anderson Consulting, my company, when I started there in 1992, was still organized on a regional office basis. I was in the Chicago office. The Chicago managing partner owned all the client relationships. The P&Ls were at the local office level. You sold local clients. In the mid-90s, we transferred to a industry-based model where we served clients nationally segmented by industry. Retail was where the industry I worked in. So we had a national retail practice. The local government market became essentially irrelevant. The local officing managing partner, new officing managing partner of Accenture, was just named as an old colleague of mine, is sort of like a corporate figurehead, candidly, in a sense. Their job is to essentially rep the brand in the town. And so that's what happened. The corporate leaders are increasingly branch managers of global corporations like JP Morgan Chase, or they are just figureheads that deal with sort of like, here's what you do, but there's no really relevance to the local businesses, or they're the CEO of a bank or a company that was a winner in the merger war and got big. And now they're really have much more than just local concerns. They sort of have national concerns. And, again, you look at the local players, the local business leaders are primarily these kinds of people who I would term basically bureaucrats. They're basically bureaucrats. They are the managers, very much more the managers that Burnham talked about than the old bank CEOs or electric company CEOs would have been. And then, again, another, just kind of a little unrelated, but I'll point out there's also a lot more domination by transactional class businesses like lawyers and things of that nature, which is why things like publicly subsidized real estate projects have become such big business. They've always been big. Now they're incredibly big. But this is what's happened. So we've seen this essentially managerialism of the local business class. There aren't as many old blue bloods as they used to be. The old, the idea of upper status has kind of gone away. So you don't have as many blue bloods. You don't have as many kind of local bank president type people. And now you've got people who are either, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who are that Davos class managerials, or you essentially have local branch managers who now they're in charge of wealth management in the Indianapolis office, as a friend of mine was, and now he's doing something overseeing commercial banking in Arizona. It's not people who are at all tied to the local economy. There's much more of a corporate, bureaucratic, managerial mindset. And so this has had a profound impact on local leadership in local communities because this managerial class essentially cannot go against or disagree with the ideologies of the national and global managerial class. They really cannot exhibit any independent thought. They basically can't. They have to follow the herd. They really cannot do anything off the menu. And so what we see is increasingly feeble civic leadership in virtually every community in the country. And I'll give a couple examples. Here in Indianapolis, one of our great legends is how we reinvented ourselves after the decline of manufacturing in the 1980s through the sports strategy. So we were one of the early cities that realized you could essentially create economic development and exposure for yourself through hosting sporting events. So we built a domed stadium in 1984 with no team to play in it. Build it and they will come, and the Indianapolis Colts relocated to town. We hosted the National Sports Festival in 1982, which was sort of like the Olympic trials. It was very successful. When there was some problems, I think it was in Chile, may have been some problems, geopolitical problems in Chile. We're supposed to host the Pan Am Games. With like a year to go, we put our hand up and said, we'll host the Pan Am Games. So we hosted the Pan Am Games in, I think, 1987, very successful. So we essentially created this sports business through massive very high risk investments, like a dome stadium without a team to play in it, that nobody else was doing. So it was an innovative, high risk strategy to reinvent the city that paid off. And we still host NCAA tournaments regularly. It's still a big business for us. I do not believe Indianapolis could ever do anything comparable today, because the leaders here today could not back an initiative of that type. They don't have the clout to say, yes, we're going to make a huge investment without a guaranteed payoff on it. Their appetite for risk is lower, and their ability to do something that all of the people in every other city is doing is just low, super, super, super low. So we've essentially had a much more enfeebled civic leadership class. It's very bureaucratic, very corporate, not a single kind of blue blood type, not a single kind of like old mover and shaker type, like the bank presidents around. Secondly is you see this in the way that the local civic leadership class in Rust Belt cities, who have basically seen their cities destroyed by trade, by globalization, by all these ideologies that have tremendously advantaged coastal elite centers like New York, DC, San Francisco, and really hurt the Midwest, hurt the Rust Belt. Nevertheless, if you go to Chicago, if you go to Detroit, if you go to Cleveland, if you go to Cincinnati, Columbus, Ohio, every single civic leader supports 100% all of these ideologies that have disadvantaged their city. And that's because they cannot put the interest and preferences of their own local environment ahead of these managerial ideologies, because they're part of that class and their primary loyalty is to the managerial class. There are no longer local elites in any material sense of the word. Managerialism has devoured all of the local elites. And so that's why these people are the biggest champions of the ideologies that are killing them. And I think what we've seen is one of the geniuses of the current system, and you could say it's managerialism, or you could just use that as a shorthand for our system, is its ability to co-opt all potential sources of rival elites into its matrix. And so all the local elites have essentially been absorbed because there are no more essentially local businesses. We also see the same thing that's happened on a racial basis, where the elite, the top 20%, top 10% of every racial group gets absorbed into this managerial society and often have values and interests very different than the rank and file. Elite Hispanic businessmen have no problem saying Latinx or whatever, Latinx. They don't really care, even if the average Hispanic person in America doesn't even know what that is. Their loyalties are to the class. And DEI, I think one of its core functions in our society is to bind potential rival elites from these other groups into this managerial nexus by sort of binding them into the system. But the next thing you know, if you wonder why people in Cleveland think that the solution for Cleveland is more immigration, and why the elite of Cleveland, even though there's no immigration going to Cleveland, or why the elite of, all these cities support the most global free trade regime possible, it's because all of those people have now been absorbed into the managerial class, and there are no more local elites who are particularly attached to their community. And I think if you look at the place where you live, you will see this behavior is essentially pervasive everywhere. So I'll stop right there.
Thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks to all of our panelists. This was a really thorough and interesting discussion, and we have a lot of good questions, and I have questions myself. So let's get right to it and see how many of these we can get through. I think one of the first questions that I'm going to ask kind of just will help us tease out some of Burnham's view. It's from the chat. It says, what are the earlier intellectual antecedents to managerialism? And I might add, should we think of managerialism as something that has intellectual antecedents, or is it primarily something that was brought about by material forces? In other words, how much of a Marxist did Burnham remain after he left kind of the Marxist Trotskyist camp?
I'll take the first shot at that. I would say Burnham, as a Trotskyite, as a materialist, would have said that managerialism was a product of material forces. And I think ultimately you could trace it to the revolution in scale that was enabled by, kind of the second industrial revolution, if you want to call it that, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Whereas in 1870, we were still by and large a nation of small businesses. In 1930, there were essentially 0 businesses in America that employed more than 100 people. You could identify them all on the fingers of one hand. It was like a couple ammunition manufacturers backed by the government, a couple of cotton, a couple of textile mills in New England, the Second Bank of the United States when it existed, but there just weren't big companies. The railroads were the first modern corporation, the first companies that had to invent middle management as we know it. And, by the early 1900s, we are essentially dominated by many large corporations. And there's a great book that documents the development of modern management, over this period. It's called The Visible Hand, The Managerial Revolution in American Business by the renowned economic historian Alfred Chandler. It's a very, very dry book, but incredibly fascinating. But in essence, as companies got gigantic, as cities got gigantic, as government had to get gigantic in response, that necessitated the development of managerial systems, which were not fully created. Even modern accounting was really not fully created until the Great Depression, basically. That all these techniques and systems there. So I think it was primarily a product of material forces more than an intellectual movement per se, although there were some people who identified aspects of it. Julius alluded to Burrell and Means. I don't know if it's Burrell or Burley. I can't remember that guy's how you pronounce this guy's name. And then there was an Italian Marxist named Bruno Rizzi who wrote a book, I think it was in French, called The Bureaucratization of the World. He was also in Trotsky's orbit, and he basically described the Soviet Union as a basically managerialist system. My understanding is it's not totally clear how much influence, if any, that had on Burnham. He didn't read it, but he may have heard about it through Trotsky's polemics against it. I would say so. There were some things in the air as people were analyzing what was going on there.
I would just say managerialism itself, as far as I know, no one ever proudly claimed to be a managerialist in the way that people have been avowed communists or liberals or whatever. In that sense, it's not an ideological category. It is more of a process or an analytical description. But in addition to the figures that Aaron mentioned, I think in different ways you can point to various American progressives. There's elements of this stuff in Herbert Crowley and even Woodrow Wilson. You can point to figures in the Marxist and Leninist traditions, where I think Burnham is distinct is he sort of identifies the kind of dark underside of this in the way that the other figures want to see it as kind of a very temporary phenomenon or something leading to a democratic or socialist or other kind of utopia, or at least more positive outcome, more consistent with past ideals and ideologies. Burnham is seeing this as kind of a darker future to which all these ideologies and orders are leading, regardless of the intentions of their protagonists. And in a way, if I had to point to a figure who's not really ever mentioned in the context of Burnham, but maybe perhaps prefigures him a bit more, would be Max Weber and his early analyses of bureaucracy and the sort of iron cage that bureaucracy leads the bureaucrats into.
Yeah, I will just add that in addition to the economic factors that Aaron and Julius have talked about, there's also a strategic dimension, a military dimension to the managerial revolution as well. One of the inspirations for Burnham's thinking about the way in which the world was changing with respect to its strategy and its military needs is Halford Mackinder, and Mackinder's idea of a sort of a heartland in Eurasia, which was going to be, the basis for control of the world if you could gain control over it, because of the sort of intersection of economies of scale, population numbers for consumer needs. The combination of economic and strategic interests would lead to basically the creation of larger and larger states. And you see that this is an element of the managerial revolution that actually is pretty significant within the pages of Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution. And it's something that Burnham continues to be very interested in over time. So he thinks that just as in Orwell's 1984, you have a division of the world into Oceania and East Asia and Eurasia, Burnham basically has the same sort of idea. The world is going to be divided into these very large geographic blocks. At least the sort of most productive parts of the world will be. This is for military reasons, and it also has economic implications. All of this ties into the development of the managerial class.
Luke Nathan Phillips asks, is the New Deal and mid-century American approach to government and economics, etc., best seen primarily as managerial capitalism and elite technocracy, or primarily as class war compromise and social balance? And how does Burnham view this?
Well, no, he views it as an early development in the managerial revolution. And in fact, the managerial revolution gets started in the United States, according to Burnham, around the time of World War I. Woodrow Wilson prefigures it to a great degree. I think Julius is right to mention some of the early progressives as perhaps also, morning stars of this, sort of new constellation that's arising. But the New Deal, while it does have plenty of older, more traditional forces that come into play, the structure of the New Deal itself, the fact that it's reliant on these alphabet agencies that are not, the New Deal is not a product of traditional American style government from below. It's not, a sudden uprising of, sort of popular demands to create alphabet agencies. It's really something that's done, by the sort of experts themselves. They see a need to organize both government and business along these new lines. And these new lines that they want to organize around are precisely those of the managerial revolution.
On that question, I would, analyzing this through a sort of Burnham lens without necessarily attempting to put words into Burnham's mouth myself, I would actually argue that it's both. It's very much a technocracy. It's very much a managerial society. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that in the midst of the Cold War, the managerial elites had very strong incentives and reasons for their own class status and power to enforce or encourage the sort of class compromise that prevailed in the high point of the Cold War era. Both because of the threat of the Soviet Union abroad and because of the threat of communism at home, particularly after the Great Depression. I mean, there was extraordinary fear among elites of either replicating the Depression or, if you had that kind of social unrest, you would get communist uprisings and communists taking control of countries, as it happened, of course, earlier in Russia and threatened to happen in various other European countries. So I think you can say, I don't think it's wrong to say that it was at once managerial, but at the same time, the managers had much more incentive then to impose sorts of class compromises than they have since the end of the Cold War, when you had a very united elite with much less internal or external pressure to do that sort of thing.
So Henry George asks, he's written a longer question. I think it's perceptive. Burnham's perspective is invaluable for the, quote, non-normie right in restraining conservatives' tendency towards materiality denying idealism. And I think here we might think of the way that conservatives often like to go ascribe a lot of causality to ideas. Ideas have consequences. Spend a lot of time thinking about the role of the intellectual and less time thinking about the nature of power, which is something that Burnham focuses on a lot. However, Henry continues, I'm concerned that this focus on managerial structures, institutions, and networks can depersonalize the individual as a part of these structures, institutions, and networks. We see this in the later writing of Burnham's chief disciple, Samuel Francis, for example. This depersonalization is something that Paul Gottfried raises in After Liberalism. What do the speakers think of this concern? And if it's valid, how do we balance the still essential managerial diagnosis with a framework that maintains the importance of the individual person?
I'll just say that I think this gets at one of the weaknesses in Burnham's theory, and it's not that it causes Burnham's theory to collapse, but it is a facet of modern life that I think is insufficiently highlighted in Burnham's work. That is this sort of growing sense of entropy, that you have this managerial elite, you have this managerial revolution, which has overtaken the private sector and the public sector here in the United States and basically all around the world. And yet this new system is struggling for legitimacy, and people feel deeply alienated from it. There is, and there's this crisis among the managerial elite themselves. They know that they are illegitimate. They know that they are not able to secure the affections and the loyalty of the public. And it precisely does arise from this dehumanization. And, Aaron had mentioned that scale itself may be one reason for the managerial revolution. And scale itself is depersonalizing, that if you're just one unit among 300 million or one unit among, 6 billion, you are virtually nothing in the scale of things at that point. Burnham, wanted to have Burnham made it quite clear that, he believed the managerial revolution was inevitable. It was not something that was going to be turned back, but it was also not something he, welcomed, that he thought was a wonderful, development for humanity. In fact, he preferred an older, more bourgeois, more traditional form of civilization, but that personal preference was not going to change the way in which the world was going. And this is the, sort of difficulty that conservatives are faced with right now. What are we able to salvage, not only of traditional institutions of an earlier era, but even of, sort of human nature, human dignity, human life itself in this more depersonalized, mass-based world where, your choices are either conforming to the managerialist system or rejecting it, but rejecting it in a way that turns you into a kind of anarchist or a kind of antinomian, and you just wind up sort of being embittered and the worst sort of, just a rejectionist that you see on some of the alt-right. And it seems to me the right has not yet, figured out an answer to this. We know, some of the palliative steps we can take. We know some of the sort of moderate things we can do in order to shore up existing institutions and to try to combat this excessive alienation. But it seems to me as if, the system as a whole is not only tending towards a greater and greater managerialism, but the, sort of the antithesis of this greater managerialism is a growing sense of entropy, alienation, and, ultimately this makes people sort of susceptible to fantastical radical ideologies, even the way in which fantasy novel language has infiltrated political thought, where, people like Curtis Yarvin, who I think was sort of quietly alluded to by Julius in his remarks earlier, we're talking about dark elves versus hobbits rather than Pareto's class 1 and class 2 residues. All of this, shows a sign of, one reaction to managerialism is a flight into fantasy. And I think that's ultimately unhealthy for the right. But what to do about it, I'm not entirely sure.
I would say Burnham, is a Marxist. He certainly, his heritage was when he's writing Managerial Revolution, certainly saw things in terms of personal forces. But I can't help but notice that the people who are most enamored of Burnham today, and even going back to Burnham himself, were also materialist in the sense of being hard atheists. Burnham, whatever his connection with his Catholic upbringing may have been later in life, was operating as essentially an atheist materialist in that sense of the word. The same thing is true of Sam Francis. The same thing is true of Curtis Yarvin. And so I think the loss of the spiritual dimension and particularly the Christian concern for the importance of the particularity of the individual tends to lead people to radical conclusions when they start applying tools like managerialism to analyze society. If you read Burnham's Leviathan and Its Enemies, his book that he was published posthumously, but he wrote it in, I think, 1995, his basic answer is to the inevitability of managerialism is that you have to defeat the current, what he called soft managerial regime with a hard managerial regime, which seems to be some form of fascism, candidly. And so I think one reason a lot of this online right crowd is very drawn to fascist solutions, fascist imagery, is very much because they are in this hard atheist materialist model. And that, I think, is one of the things to be attentive to in the way of it is. And I think the spiritual dimensions of society and the way, again, that Christianity had a concern for the individual, whatever depersonalized things may have been, is the loss of that, I think, also paves the way for some of these, more extremist views.
Let me perhaps try to, again, to maybe square the circle a little bit. I certainly agree with the danger or temptation that exists in going too deeply or too far with Burnham or this materialist mode of or abstract mode of analysis. On the other hand, I think we do have to say that for many decades, in one book review I wrote, I described, the right has been a sort of radicalism that instead of materialism and collectivism, it's been individualism and idealism, and often to the total exclusion of any real material or economic analysis outside of sort of Adam Smith cheerleading. And Burnham is one of the only sources, I think, and access points for people within the right-wing tradition to grapple with some of these material elements, particularly when some of the more idealistic dreams have broken down. It's also, I think, the case that a lot of history and political analysis on the left has become, in both sides, but also the left, perhaps surprisingly, has become extremely moralistic. The 1619 Project, this notion that kind of everything is attributable to race, and sort of bad people doing bad things because they have bad morals and they're, exploitative. And they sort of ground that in colonialism and stuff like that, but it tends to be extremely moralistic. So I think the pendulum can swing too far, but I wouldn't mind if the pendulum keeps swinging a little bit further in Burnham's direction, and we maybe get back to a little more kind of concrete, materialistic in an old-fashioned way analysis of social trends, and do a little bit better job of connecting kind of our moral outlooks and social the superstructure, if you will, with some of the economic base, even if we don't necessarily have to go all the way in pure causal economic reductionism.
I want to conclude with a really quick question that I think each speaker has, on a topic that I think each speaker has alluded to, and that is what is often described as the culture war. I think that Burnham would have an analysis of the culture war that is perhaps a little bit different than what a lot of conservatives might provide. It's not going to be that simply a matter of bad ideas disseminating into a free marketplace of ideas. So I want to conclude maybe with each speaker talking a little bit about how Burnham's thought can maybe reframe or shed light on what we've come to describe as the culture war today.
Well, one thing I just might say is if you look at the left version of the left side, if you will, of the culture war, embodied in things like in the corporate form, ESG or DEI, all of the woke apparatus, these are among the ideologies of managerialism. And because managerialism is a product of the economic structure of our society, that culture war side has economic power, social power, political power behind it, where the other side, the more traditionally conservative, say the social conservatives, do not. And ergo, you lose pretty much every time in that scenario. And one of the problems that conservatives face is that they essentially do not have essentially an economic base. As it were, there's not some collection of industries or other elites out there whose kind of economic or other powers and interests necessarily align with their side of the culture war. And, that's very problematic.
Yeah, I would simply agree with what Aaron has said. Burnham would look at the culture war as being an epiphenomenon of more fundamental economic and power-based struggles, political power, economic power, et cetera. And the fact that, the right has lost, most of its institutions, even the institutions that the right tends to rely upon, including those that are explicitly conservative themselves, think tanks and media outlets and others, they've been absorbed into the overall structure of managerialism. And as they've been absorbed into the managerial structure, they have adopted managerial ideologies. And, just as some of our friends, point to the fact that oftentimes the debates that you see in American politics are really between a kind of right liberalism and a left liberalism, I think Burnham would say that, in fact, what we see are these debates, including a lot of culture war debates, that are either a clash between right managerialism and left managerialism, or varieties of left managerialism, some of which may call themselves conservative, or alternatively, and here I think, what Julia said in response to the last question is quite right, that the left has a, managerialist approach, which is integrated with ideology, whereas the right simply has a kind of, fluffy, romantic, idealistic approach, which wants to invoke culture and ideas in a very vague way, but is not connected either to, economic power or to real political organization. I mean, as Aaron said, when you don't have any kind of base, when you just have ideas that are detached from any kind of social force, you're going to lose. And but oftentimes the right seems to be quite comfortable losing because it's in a position of being able to sort of either say I told you so, or just sort of sit back and complain about the world going to hell. But the idea of actually changing things, of actually using power in a way that understands what is inevitable about the managerial revolution and taking the reins of it, that is something that not only is the right very reluctant to do, but as Aaron had mentioned when talking about Sam Francis and his book, Leviathan and Its Enemies, when the right does try to talk about gaining the reins of power, as in the case of Sam Francis, what you wind up with is something that even Francis himself would be very reluctant to express publicly, because what Francis ultimately winds up talking about is not the idea of a nice middle American revolution where basically ordinary small town Americans are rising up against bureaucrats and sort of corporate hacks. Ultimately, what Francis winds up concluding on in that book is the idea that you have to have some sort of hard managerial revolution, which is going to be sounds quasi-fascistic, in order to counteract this kind of soft totalitarianism of left-wing managerialism. Well, that's not something that most right-wingers are going to embrace, and those who do wind up sounding imbecilic because they just haven't even thought through the implications of what they're actually saying. So the right has a real problem here, and it seems to me that one of the great things about Burnham and Sam Francis as well is that they force us to confront these questions before we hastily offer our answers. And I think that's the point on which I'll conclude my part today.
Yeah, I've been trying to use the time afforded by the other speakers to come up with something really brilliant and insightful to say on this. Unfortunately, I just have to tell you that I agree with both those statements and can only maybe reiterate my earlier point that I think the neocon, the first generation neocon focus on kind of the new class as a sort of decadent or deviant set of left-wing bureaucrats, distinct from the actual developments within capitalism, what Burnham would call managerial capitalism. That I think has proved to be both an analytical and a political mistake, and has really ever since then, and as long as that sort of fiction is maintained, it seems very difficult for me to imagine the right really being able to compete for the commanding heights of the culture war, because they can't really compete for the commanding heights of the economy. I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but perhaps that's appropriate for a discussion on Burnham.
I think that is. And I once again want to thank our three distinguished panelists for a really fun conversation today. And as I conclude, I want to mention that this is the first of, as I said before, an ongoing series where I hope to continue to have conversations about thinkers like James Burnham, who have very interesting things to say about both the right, the conservative movement, and American society today. So if you liked what you heard, please consider, first of all, joining the National Association of Scholars if you have not already joined and added yourselves to the rank of member. And also, as this video comes out on YouTube, it's streaming right now to YouTube, please share it, spread the word about this series and the other webinars that we put on. That would be a great help to us to continue to put out this really interesting and penetrating content. So with that, once again, thank you to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great day.